Hi everyone, Alessandro Ferretti here. Profuse apologies if I cannot be there in person to support you in this conference. I have snapped recently my ACL cruciate, anterior cruciate ligament in a karate event, and I just had it reconstructed, so I'm not really able to travel as present. And thank you obviously for the invitation. So what we're going to see today are ketogenic application in health. This is a little bit about me. I have been researching ketogenic application for the last four and a half years, and I qualified as a nutritionist and then started to get more and more involved into research, and I just finished to co-author some research paper and also running my own research projects. The learning objectives for today is to look at what is a ketogenic diet and potential application. Obviously, to summarize what is a ketogenic diet and application in 40 minutes is going to be quite a tough challenge. So if you have not heard of this before, today is going to give you an introduction. And if you have some experience, and perhaps you may find some of the things that I have covered today maybe of some use, and so you can actually research it a little bit further. We're going to look what are the benefits to patients and also clinical application, user safety and limitations. In addition, we look at potential how method for tracking. If you rely on insulin to clear glucose from your blood, you are already in trouble. I absolutely totally love this statement, and there is a lot of truth in this. So the agenda for today, looking at ketogenic diet of potential clinical interest, especially in certain subset population. We look at fuel, glucose and ketones and fats, optimizing fueling systems, look at achieving a ketogenic state, but also we're going to focus on some of the pitfalls and cautions. And at the end, you have an appendix tool where you can actually look at more in-depth ketogenic aids and contraindication and also all the references. So, what is a ketogenic diet and could it be of your clinical interest? So we know that different substrate, fats, carbohydrates and proteins can be all simmered down into our TCA cycle, Krebs cycle, triboxylic cycle. All of these would provide some form of energy. Protein seems to be obviously very highly thermogenic, and it seems that the body seems to have preference for proteins to use not so much as energy, unless there is a strong catabolism present, but also to perhaps support construction of tissues and remodeling of tissues or recovery. So the two primary fuels that the body seems to prefer would be fat and carbohydrates. Now, we know the different cells would actually use different fuels. There are very, very few cells that can only function on glucose, but for the vast majority of our cells, by far the vast majority, our body can utilize ketones, fatty acids, and at the same time, glucose. Now, as far as ketogenic diet application, there are potential common applications across the globe. So we know that has been used in cardiovascular diseases, has been used in obesity, has been used for type 2 and also type 1 diabetes, and in some cases also for certain type of cancers. These are things that have been documented by science. But what we're going to see today is also something more related to metabolism, so really coherent with aging and metabolic efficiency. So in addition to that, there is some really interesting research looking at type 3 diabetes, also known as cognitive degeneration or Alzheimer's. This was very recently renamed as type 3 diabetes. One of the things that all of these have in common is right on the center of the screen, the mitochondrial efficiency. So this is a summary of the benefit of ketogenesis. So we look at optimization of glucose metabolism, improving insulin sensitivity, having an effect on inflammatory response, and either via or independently from mitochondria. If we look at certain application, for example, we also look at biogenesis of mitochondria, but this can actually be achieved in slightly different ways, not just with ketogenic application. Also, we look at cardiovascular health, energy efficiency, once again, also in physical performance, not just at metabolic level. But in addition, some interesting research on epigenetic control. And as we mentioned earlier already, cognition, anti-seizure, and neural modulation. So our fuel, if we look at glucose and ketones and fats, what is the main difference among these? Well, in order to control glucose, these are the three main primary classes: the insulin, glucagon, and glucocorticoids. Of course, glucose regulation is very heavily regulated by a myriad of hormones and things that we have trying to control our body. But these will be the main key regulator, main action induced by and inhibited by. Now, some of these hormones are very, very responsive to environmental changes. So, for example, food, or for example, stress response. So anything that we have and change in our environment can affect our glucose control. In fact, in my very research project, I found very strong correlation between environmental factors not necessarily related to actual food, but we'll see that in a little bit details later. So this is a pathway planner taken from seekinghealth.com. You can actually see the steps that are involved in order to take glucose from absorption all the way to utilization, all the way down to acetyl coenzyme A, just prior entering the TCA cycle. As far as ketones, that could be also an alternative fuel to actual glucose. Now, these are produced in the liver via mitochondrial matrix from acetyl coenzyme A. And when I say from acetyl coenzyme A, I'm likely to use in this context from an excess of acetyl coenzyme A, or a very high level of acetyl coenzyme A compared to oxaloacetate, but we're going to see that a little bit later. So these will actually travel externally from the liver, so extrahepatically, to other tissue in order to be used for energy. The liver misses the enzyme that can actually allow the body to use ketones for its own energy. And if glucose and insulin are present in specific levels, this path tends to be inhibited. So when both of these two substrates are present, then that pathway seems to be suppressed. Now, fats are broken down in three main ketones. Now, the first one would be beta-hydroxybutyrate, and this is produced, generally speaking, between 1:1 or 1:2 ratio beta-hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate. And this is what we would tend to measure in urine. But this is normally quite volatile as a compound. The acetoacetate can also be then transformed into acetone, and this is what gives us this specific breath. In fact, some of the ways to test if someone is in ketosis, as we will see later, would actually be through breath. Ideally, we look at beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, and any further excess in usage then will actually get converted into acetone. I tend to see beta-hydroxybutyrate as what is actually spilled over in blood, as a little extra buffer when oxaloacetate is too low and the body still is in positive energetic state. So we have a limited carbohydrate supply. As you can see here, there is a glucose that has to be manufactured, and we will enter gluconeogenesis. And either from dietary sources or our store, more importantly, we can manufacture glucose. We can actually manufacture glucose from any of the other substrates, obviously from carbohydrate, but protein, some amino acids are very highly gluconeogenic, and also triglyceride, using the actual in triglyceride, the glycerol part, the backbone with the 3 fatty acids attached, that can be converted into glucose. So in a way, we look at ketosis as gluconeogenesis, in the sense that gluconeogenesis has to be present. So this is where things are starting to get quite important for our own scope. So we have fatty acids. When these will actually look into entering our body, you can actually see here the oxaloacetate. So when the ratio of oxaloacetate to acetyl coenzyme A is way in favor of acetyl coenzyme A, the liver will automatically start to actually make ketones. So as far as fatty acid production, we actually look fatty acid into acetyl coenzyme A, all the way down to trickle down to acetyl coenzyme A, entering the actual TCA cycle, triboxylic acid cycle. This is what actually takes to the body to manufacture energy from the fatty acid. So we actually see that in the two red circle, the one on your right is the one taking energy from fatty acid in general. And the one at the center of the slide on your left is the one that actually would manufacture ketones. And as you can see, both of these can actually go to acetyl coenzyme A. And as you can see, the steps are actually quite contained compared to the one that we saw earlier of the glucose. So, optimizing fueling systems. Now, do we have a glucose bias? Well, we were taught, not only taught, that glucose is the best form of energy. And this can be reasonably true. As we know, glucose is always present in our body, whereas ketones and fatty acid, yes, but ketones not necessarily. So you start to wonder, well, would actually be ketosis a natural state of being? Maybe not so, as we can see from our assumptions made on our biology, but yet again, our body should be able to switch and not only and constantly rely on our glucose. We know that glucose is important for physical performance in certain cells. However, in some circumstances, the body should be able to switch fuels quite seamlessly. Whereas, given our dietary habits and the constant hyperavailability of food and refined food, unfortunately, this is not happening very well. And, if you're constantly relying on glucose, we seem to lose the ability to use fat efficiently for energy. Whereas fat, as far as fuel, will actually provide much better bucks for what you actually get. So the oxidation of 1 gram of fat releases about twice as much energy as the oxidation of a gram of glycogen. So you are very, very profitable. And we can store actually better, which is one of the problems. But the problems that we have is that we store a lot of fat and yet we're not able to access it because our glucose is constantly elevated and we're highly insulin resistant. This is one of the problems because our body should be able to use both. So this is where we look at our ability to use fats as our primary form of fuel. Now, we know the mitochondria, once we feed them, will generate heat, ATP, free radical, and obviously CO2. Now, depending upon what we feed and what they burn, we tend to have slightly different proportion of ATP, energy, and heat. Actually, to be quite clear, the ATP is the carrier for the energy. Now, if we look at the fueling efficiency, a 16 carbon long fatty acid is 129 ATPs, which is 96 ATP from coenzyme A, 35 ATP from fat, pH, and NADH. Whereas glucose has, in a way, only 30p. So the efficiency between the two is substantially different. So in addition to that, there are also changes within the heat. Now, fatty acid seems to be generating less entropy, which is the chaos within the cells, whereas glucose is able to burn much more quicker and fast, yet at the same time can generate a little bit more entropy, which is the dissipation of energy. So when we look at ketones, we know that ketones can enter our mitochondria quite quickly, and one ketone will generate two acetyl coenzyme A. So we have fats that are very, very efficient as far as you can see from here, the long-chain fatty acid entering, short-chain fatty acid also entering directly without having to be shifted through. And in addition to that, we also have ketones. So you can actually see that out of the fatty acid, we get a lot of potential energy. And all of this process does not actually involve insulin at all. So someone is resistant at this level in insulin here. It doesn't actually matter if someone is using actually fatty acid. In fact, as we will see, the more ketogenic and metabolically optimized ability to make energy, the least insulin is needed and the least glucose is actually burned. Nowadays, we are often in an overfed state. It's not just the high calories, but it's also the high and hyper-energetic state, as we can find food pretty much anywhere we go. In fact, what tends to be very upsetting to me is that in many countries, you actually find a fizzy, sugary drink that is actually cheaper than water. And refined food is normally very, very, very cheap. So you can find highly refined, highly condensed food for very, very, very little price. And normally this is always lower compared to healthy food. And this overfed state will lead to constantly high level of glucose, inflammatory response, and hyperinsulinemia. Eventually, this hyperinsulinemia will lead to insulin resistance, both as far as postprandial, but also as fasting. And this could have a very, very detrimental effect, not only on the glucose circulation inflammation, but also looking at longer-term impairments of mitochondrial function. So as far as the energy that we use, in a fed state, we utilize virtually 100% glucose. In a fasting state or starvation state, we actually look at about 35% glucose, and the rest is actually split between ketones and fats. And normally ketogenesis seems to reflect some of the aspects of fasting. Obviously, too much fats in the diet, even in a ketogenic state, will lead to potential problems. So please be aware to maintain a certain degree of energetic state, which we'll see that in a bit. So eventually we look at the cost of fuel. How far do we need to wait until actual refueling? What is the efficiency, and how much heat will actually this will generate in order for us? So just imagine two different types of engines that we can actually have. Achieving a ketogenic state, how do we do that? So what is, first of all, a ketogenic diet and keto-adapted diet? So most of the time we actually see a high protein diet splattered everywhere on the keto world, but the ketogenic diet and keto-adapted diet is not necessarily a high protein diet. We tend to recommend to have a reasonably high level of protein, normally a bare minimum of 1.2 grams of protein per kilo mass, lean mass, but hopefully maybe a little bit more, maybe looking at 1.4, 1.5. And this has to be adjusted, obviously, depending upon the activity. Now, if we look at the levels of intake, generally there are between 5 and 10% of carbohydrate, 10 to 15% of protein, and the rest is classified as fat. And there is a pie chart of what it looks like. Now, in order to promote ketogenesis, there are mainly two ways to actually achieve that. So we find ketones in our blood for two main reasons, actually three. One, if we take a supplement of ketones, which I don't tend to recommend unless there is a very specific reason why someone wants to have ketones in blood, for example, cancer, dementia, epilepsy, or someone is fasting, this is where we start to raise the ketones, or the level of fats within the diet are normally high. These are the three main stages. So ideally, we actually look at what can we do in order to achieve this ketogenesis state. But really, the purpose of this is to optimize mitochondrial performance and energy efficiency, metabolic flexibility, as I like to call it. The things that would inhibit ketogenesis is obviously anything that would actually raise glucose level and generate a potential insulinogenic response. So poor quality short-term sleep, for example, obviously carbohydrates and excess food, a very overly fed state food, and also prolonged chronic sympathetic activation, especially in glucocorticoids. So how do we actually implement this with the client? So the first thing I tend to do is try to understand what are the potential problems of the client. So does he have access to these type of foods? Does he have the economical resources in order to afford a healthy diet? Is the person able to achieve that state? So for example, if people have ever tried fasting and they feel quite well, then normally they would fit a ketogenic diet very, very well. This is an assumption, so you obviously need to refine it. But normally, the first stages of adaptation of the ketogenic diet are normally the hard one. These are the ones that tends to be quite challenging for the individual to actually go through. So this is something definitely we need to investigate further on a one-to-one basis with each client. And some people just really don't fit the actual diet. However, one thing to bear in mind is that when we look at adapting to a ketogenic state, it is really, really important that the people will actually go and give it a proper go. So maybe looking at leaving 3 to 5 weeks to really become familiar to the actual foods, but also for the body to make that adaptation. So what do we eat? Well, as far as the carbohydrates, I consider net carbohydrates, so the total level of carbohydrates minus the fiber. We look at sources with low starch and high fiber in order to support our microbiome, as we will see. Protein, we have meat, fish, eggs. Not had a very good success with vegan version of actually ketogenic, primarily because we go either in a very, very highly concentrated, refined type of protein coming from soy, and I'm not a great fan of that, and or wherever you find protein on a vegan diet, you normally also find carbohydrates. So obviously, this could be a bit of a problem. And in some individuals, if their intake of protein is high, can potentially trigger an insulinogenic response. We need gluconeogenesis in order to be in a ketogenic state. So normally proteins up to the levels I just mentioned are not a problem. And as far as fat, we actually look at animal produce, the fat from the fish, coconut oil, avocado, olive oil, nuts and seeds, and there's definitely normally there are plenty, but the main idea behind it, one of the rules I tend to follow is try to eat the food that is as close as possible to nature as you would find it in nature. This is normally something I keep saying to people in order to make sure that they don't just look at the macro, but also they look at the quality of the food and are good. So this is an example. So for example, people can have like a vegetable shake at breakfast, so they could have breakfast with eggs and smoked salmon with some vegetables in it. Lunch could be some fish with some low carbohydrate type of vegetables, and dinner, once again, you can still be a piece of meat or something, perhaps another piece of fish. So you can kind of swap, but if you go to patriciadali.com, you can actually see lots of recipes, but there are quite a few books now as far as keto. So how do we track progresses? Well, I have quite a few videos. If you actually go to alessandroferretti.co.uk, in the video section there are actually quite a few, but you also see quite a few of my podcasts they have done. There is nothing to buy, so you can be totally safe to go in that have nothing to sell. It's just my research. So you can have urine testing, which are great as a starting point, but as the body becomes more and more accustomed to use what we call fat adapted or keto adapted, it's not something I like saying that, but to give you an idea, normally the body will start to not spill out the acetoacetate in urines, but it will start to actually retain. We'll also look at blood test. There is both glucose and ketones. The ketones in blood is beta-hydroxybutyrate because the acetoacetate is way too volatile. And also breath testing. And the breath testing is we measure acetone. We'll see which one we look into. So this is for you a step-by-step action to look at what we are going to do with the patient. So first of all, ensure that the client is suitable for ketogenic diet and look at the appendix on the things that we tend to be careful of. I personally prefer to have a full blood count to actually look for major imbalances and definitely no diagnosis of any diseases or genes deficiency that could potentially be very counterproductive. Now, if the client is insulin resistant and or constantly elevated blood glucose level, I would start with 60 to 75 grams of carbohydrates for the first 3 to 4 weeks and then perhaps start to actually reduce it little by little. So in order to try to make that transition a little bit more smoother. And within the second step, we look at glucose level to really try to stabilize, ideally around 6 millimolar or 108 milligrams per deciliter, depending on what is the measuring units that you use. Now, as far as the aim for that we have, ideally, an optimal level will be anything between 4.7 to 5. So between 85 milligrams per deciliter all the way to maybe 90. And this is what we are aiming for. And once these blood glucose have a bit more stable, then we really can start to focus a little bit more on the ketones. However, our purpose is to increase metabolic efficiency, not to actually show ketones in our blood. If we show ketones in our blood, but the body is still a metabolic disaster, obviously it completely deters away from our goal. So how do we know that this is actually happening? As we mentioned, we have urine testing, blood testing, and breath testing. And within the appendix, you have all the details of the kit that I use, but normally these are pretty straightforward. So as far as the clinical evaluation, there is a little chart in here for you in order to see what can potentially be done in order to optimize the body and your evaluation on it. So if, for example, beta-hydroxybutyrate, so if the blood ketones are low and acetone is low, maybe the person is not in full ketosis, maybe they're having a little bit too many carbs, or maybe they have too much energetic intake, because then in that case will actually show that the body is in an overly fed state. Then we look at high beta-hydroxybutyrate and low acetone, then maybe there is a poor conversion. And if the beta-hydroxybutyrate is low and acetone is very high, obviously perhaps we need to reevaluate the total caloric intake in order to perhaps adapt a little bit better. So what are the common pitfalls of this diet? Well, the first one that I have found is that when people do feel dramatically better on this diet, and the vast majority do as long as they're suitable, people seem to try to force feed themselves to try to match the same caloric value. Now, what we have found, and this is, I do strongly suggest that you observe our videos on energetic estimation, calories, and food quotient. What we have found in a nutshell is that once someone is using fats and ketones as a primary
form of energy, the caloric estimation seems to be out, and generally is around 20% overestimated. So in a way, let's assume that my body under normal standard diet will require 2,000 calories in order to stay alive. If I switch to a ketogenic diet and start to become very efficient in utilizing energy, I may need up to 20% less, generally speaking between 15 to 20%. So that's the reason why we tend to advise the people to eat to satiety, not trying to match the calories. As you know, calories is a form of approximation of what is the heat released in a calorimeter, and this is not quite the same as it happens in our mitochondria. We also tend to fail our metabolic demand, so the standard percentage approach tends to have some shortfalls. In fact, if you look at the appendix, we have explained that if you look at the macros in percentage of proportions, protein are going to be out. If you match the proteins, then the calories are out. That's the reason why we tend to prefer and measure the food quotient, as we see in the slide before in our website, for example, making sure that you fix the protein first at what is ideal. So for me, my sweet spot is around 1.4 to 1.5 on average grams of protein per kilogram mass. I maintain my carbohydrate at around 30 to 50 in non-training day, and perhaps a little bit more in training days. And then the rest I actually need is going to be fat. I find that a lot better and a lot more precise than trying to actually meet percentages in food. Insulin disruption, so anything that would upset our metabolic state of insulin will potentially be a sabotage for our ketogenic diet. So there are certain things, for example, that in excess of certain foods that in itself may not be a problem, but consumed over a certain amount of quantity will potentially lead to a very strong insulin disruption. So that can take the person back onto actually functioning on actually mainly glucose. So, which we always have glucose in our bloodstreams, but it will actually start to shift the metabolism, suppressing what we get from our fats. So in excess of ketones, I see people that have high glucose level, they go and buy these keto supplements and then add it to an already elevated blood glucose level, creating a metabolic disaster. That is also insulinogenic and highly insulinogenic. So that, in my view, in our view, will actually aggravate the insulin resistance that someone may have. So before actually using exogenous ketones, I definitely would think very, very carefully. One of the things that we tend to advise is actually look at the carbohydrate tolerance. And I created this chart. So this will be the diabetic range, and the higher is the sensitivity of the person to carbohydrate. In a way, the lower I try to maintain the actual carbohydrate. So, for example, if we look at it, ideally we want to look at the green zone, which is between 60 and 100. And this is the carbohydrate intake during the day. So some people can be quite happy having 60, 80. I can now have around 160, 180 grams of carbohydrate, and these will be disposed very, very quickly and without any problems, even coming from fast-releasing carbohydrate. Careful a touch on overeating protein, especially if there are any form of kidney problems, and can potentially be also very highly thermogenic and potentially interfere with some metabolic pathways, but I have not found any major problem with that. Obviously, protein can be also insulinogenic, but the effect tends to be very short-lived. So I wouldn't really be concerned as far as protein being, kicking you out of ketosis. I don't tend to go along with that. Now, as far as the nutrient index, the insulin index of food, a person called Marty Kendall, I like to call him a colleague again as well, has a website called Optimizing Nutrition. He has done a fantastic work looking at nutrient density, but also the insulin index and the insulinogenic effect of certain foods. So, for example, you take jelly beans and raisins, they are pretty sweet, both of them, but you can actually see that the insulinogenic effect is dramatically different. So, or by the other hand, buttered fish and white fish, you can actually see the level of carbohydrates is very different, but is also the insulinogenic effect is also. So porridge is here creating an insulin index that is very, very low, and you look at the baked beans are actually quite high. So I'm not saying that insulin is bad, I'm saying that in overuse in an insulin-resistant person, plus adding an excess of carbohydrate, that is not obviously fantastic. So this is the glucose and ketone index, which you can actually find in the appendix. Two great contributors to that index, obviously Marty Kendall and as mentioned, so this is where the estimation is. And also someone else called Raymond Edwards, and that you have all your information in the appendix, which you will be provided. So ideally we want to look at between low ketosis all the way up to optimal ketosis, but do consider that optimal ketosis in my view is when we have a very specific medical condition. Keto adapted is slightly modified, and we can actually use medium chain triglyceride MCT oils, normally extracted from coconut, in order to perhaps allow us to have a slightly higher level of carbohydrates and adjust the protein a little bit higher. So if we add these MCT oils, we can actually have a slightly higher proportions of carbohydrates and protein. Alcohol, very small amount of alcohol can be converted into ketones very readily. Unfortunately, if we go over a certain amount, the alcohol will be highly insulinogenic and obviously suppress our ketogenesis. And stress response, as mentioned earlier, glucocorticoid activation, especially on an ongoing chronic level, can interfere with the optimal effect of a ketogenic diet. So some form of stress management are highly advisable, but if this being an anti-aging conference, so if this being any conference, stress management is highly important as far as aging. And I tend to specialize also in research on heart rate variability, and once again you can go on my website and actually look at HRV, but you can also have your own questionnaire or other ways to evaluate the stress response. One of the other big pitfalls on the ketogenic diet is the constant grazing. We have not been designed to eat like cows. Cows are constantly grazing and seem to do okay, whereas unfortunately for us is very, very different. Our body should be very efficient in going for a period of time without really having to have foods. When I started, I had to eat little and often all the time, whereas now I can eat 1, twice a day, sometimes I eat 3 if I'm training, but most of the times the body can go for hours. Just consider that if someone would struggle to go without food for 2 to 3 hours, they know that metabolically they're not very efficient. The body has to rely on what it goes in because the partitioning of the food doesn't work very well. And this is a problem. This is a big problem. So one of the things that I would say is if you know that a person cannot go without food for 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours, even 4, then you know that there are things. It's not about that specific day, is if this keeps happening on an ongoing basis. Circadian clock dysregulation, very, very important. We have a central clock, the CSN, and also we have peripheral clocks. The central clock is regulated by light. The peripheral clocks are regulated by food. So what I tend to suggest is trying to eat normally within daylight. People can have a slightly later breakfast and an early dinner, and that in itself has been proven to be, according to my research project, my personal research project in an N equal 37, to improve glucose level just in itself, controlling for diet and many other of environmental factor. And one thing I also wanted to mention, we very briefly touched on it already, time-restricted feeding. So trying to eat in a window of between 5 to 7 hours. This is ideal because it only favors further the actual use of fatty acid as a primary source of fuel. This does not have to be a low energy diet or hypocaloric diet. This could be isocaloric or euenergetic, whatever you want to call it. But that seems to have other potential ways. It tends to force the body to be able to get energy, not constantly relying from our food intake. And there are many advantages, including BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, so things that are actually really helping in the anti-aging process. Caution, we already mentioned a few as far as the caution, the execution. This is not a diet that is suitable Monday to Friday. This has to be an approach that is on an ongoing basis. I very, very quickly and suddenly test the patient's motivation. So this is something to keep on going and actually work on it. So if someone does not have that commitment, personally, I recommend something else. You can go paleo, you can go Ornish, you can go whatever is that the person thinks is best, but definitely has to be ongoing approach. The person also has to be healthy enough. He cannot have major diseases to start with unless he's medically supervised. And also the quality of the diet has to be good. I put here a little note to actually look at about ketoacidosis. This is when both glucose and ketones are elevated with the ketones above 10 millimolar. We need to make sure that people are eating because there is substantial blunt of hunger. Some people can feel a bit cold, so this is when the protein can actually help a little bit more. And some people may have energy dips if they're not quite there in functioning optimally. In addition to that, if the fibers are too low and the fats is too high and the person does not have a very healthy gut flora, they can have substantial gastroenteric symptoms. We look at metabolism. Please be careful with salt. Salt ideally should be taken now. So we've always been taught that salt is very poor and bad for our health. Well, not on a ketogenic diet. As we reduce insulin and we start to actually shed some of the weight, unfortunately we don't retain salt very well. So after the first initial stages, we do recommend to monitor your electrolyte very, very closely. You may also look at lipid profile in order to do a cardiovascular assessment. And at the times, just careful that energy may be wax and wane, so it may not be always very constant if the person is not fully adapted as far as metabolism. At times, when people have way too low carbohydrate, I'm talking about cancer applications, so I'm talking like 5 to 10 grams of carbs in the whole day, so pretty low net carbs. There could be some problems. So, for example, in training at times, I tend to have extra 20 to 30 grams of carbohydrates. So, generally it's not a problem, but some people may be a little bit sensitive. And there could also be some hormonal shifts. There's a bit of an area of debate in here, and I'm going to leave you with this. But please do not be scared of a thyroid panel that is out of kilt, because this could actually be normal and there is a very strong debate and argument I'm making at present, because T3 is at nuclear level, is also affecting energy production, and energy production affects actually T3. So if the body becomes more efficient in making energy, maybe the negative feedback mechanism is not having to produce too high T3 because the energy is actually very efficient. In fact, TSH should actually be normal. And so TSH is normal, T4 is normal, or just the T3. And also testosterone if the protein are too low, it can actually be reduced, so definitely maintain the level of protein. So, summary, we looked at what is ketogenic diet, our fuel, glucose and ketone fat, optimizing fuel, achieving ketogenic state, common pitfalls, caution, and at the end you will have your appendix with all the little extra information I have mentioned. I hope you enjoyed this lecture. If you have any questions, you can just either write them down or just send them to me. You can go to my website. You can be all nice and relaxed about it. Once again, it's just presenting my observation, research, or things that I'm publishing at present. And I hope this very quick introduction has given you some insight either to research further or perhaps to give you an idea on the potential application. So for now, thank you very much for listening, and thank you for the great opportunity, and I hope to see you either next year or in the near future. Thank you. Bye-bye.